Well, if I may have your attention, please. Thank you all for being here for this delightful program. This museum is operated by funds from memberships and donations, and we're part of the White River Valley Historical Society, which also has a museum and research library in Forsyth. And of those, many of you here are members. Those who are not, we certainly invite you to join us. Today we're meeting in the historic structure. This building was put up in 1913 after the disastrous fire in 1912 that burned up this block. Meanwhile, we are here also as the courtesy of Barb and Joe Reish, who once operated a business in this location, and we're very grateful to them for making that possible. Today we're fortunate to hear all about the railroad that is here, and we will hope that you will listen carefully and be entertained and educated as well. So I'll introduce you to the owners to tell us about themselves and about the railroad. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi everybody, thanks for coming today. We're grateful to have the opportunity to do this presentation. When Chris asked us if we would be interested, we said absolutely we would. So my name is Kamp, and most of you may know my wife Isla, who's been the face of Branson Scenic Railway for many, many years. She sends her regrets that she can't be here today. She's been having some health issues, and so she's staying home in our house in Kansas City. So Tom Johnson is another one of our owners, and so the three of us, Tom, myself, and Isla, are the current owners of Branson Scenic Railway. I want to start out and give you a little bit of insight as to how we came to operate, or how our operation agreement is with the Missouri Northern Arkansas Railroad. The railroad through Branson is an active freight railroad, so we are a concessionaire in essence of theirs to operate our passenger train. And so they provide our engine crew and all the other employees of Branson Scenic Railway, or Branson Scenic Railway employees, all the on-train people, the depot people, our maintenance people, and we do most of our maintenance here in Branson. There's a few things we can't do, like maybe change a main generator of a locomotive, and typically when that happens we hire Midwest Locomotive out of Kansas City. This is our 27th year in Branson, and over that time we've hauled 2.4 million passengers. The railroad is still actually owned by the Union Pacific. Historically, you probably remember that this was the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and Tom has brought some models for us, and one of the models is, on this side of the table, is a Missouri Pacific train as it would have operated up until, what, about the late 60s?
Late 50s.
Late 50s. And so it's Missouri Pacific, which was then absorbed by the Union Pacific. So our contract with the M&A mentions all of those people, because the railroad ownership really is still the Missouri Pacific. The Union Pacific owns the Missouri Pacific. So we have to name all those folks as additional insured on our insurance. Now, feel free to ask any questions as we go along, or hold them to the end at your pleasure. But we'd be glad to have any interruptions you might have, because usually if the question is pertinent to you, it might be pertinent to everyone else in the room. So Tom's going to tell you a little bit about some of the early happenings before Branson Scenic Railway really got started.
I need to add one bullet point to the Missouri and Northern Arkansas relationship. When we negotiated the contract in the spring of 1993, one of the important things we had to ask for was the ability to go either north or south of Branson, in case, because of track work or whatever, we couldn't go south. We could still go north, because we didn't want to ever have to cancel a train because we couldn't go that way. So that's why we go north or south, but 90% of the time we go south. before Branson, Al and I and several other gentlemen were involved with a company in Kansas City called Rail Dome Corporation. And in 1982, we bought 5 dome cars at a bank auction in Kansas City. And we had a place, we were the only bidders at that time that had a place to store the cars, so that's why we got the bid. In those 5 dome cars was the Silver Garden. And over the years, that was the first car we refurbished and chartered out to various groups all over the United States. And I was telling some people earlier, it's been to all 4 corners of the U.S. on charters: California, Canada, Florida, and all the way to West Virginia. So we've been just about every place you can go. And the Silver Garden's also been behind 7 different steam locomotives over all those years before we came here. Probably the seed of the idea that started Branson Scenic was when the Silver Garden was in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, for one of the weekends they called the fly-ins up there. The 21st Century Railroad Club each year would run a special train using mostly Amtrak equipment, but then on the back end of the train they would have a first class section and they'd run 3 or 4 dome cars, and that's where the Silver Garden was. So once we got all the passengers up to Oshkosh, we unloaded them at the end of the runway, and we took off, and one of the other partners that owned the Silver Palace, he and I were talking at dinner that night, says, wow, you know, these cars really look great together. It's too bad we can't find a place to run them all together all the time. And at that time, I was basically aware that the line from Kansas City to down through Branson and on farther south was going to be up for a takeover, because we'd heard that the Union Pacific was trying to spin it off. So in about December, we found out the Missouri Northern Arkansas was going to be the operator of the line. So we contacted the Missouri Northern Arkansas Railroad, and make a long story short, they said, put together a business plan, come down here in, was it April?
I believe, yes.
In April, and you can make your presentation. And basically, we got the contract, and we had to start operating on August 1st. That was a killer, but we managed to get it done. And I've crossed over into your territory.
Oh, that's okay.
Well, what I should tell about the operating plan?
I can do that. So, as Tom said, we put together a proposal, and we thought the key parts of that proposal would be safety, the fact that we had equipment ready to go, hence the Silver Garden that Tom was telling you about, and the Silver Palace was the other car that was in that train to Oshkosh from Chicago.
So was the Solarium.
And so was the Silver Solarium. So when we started operating in Branson, well, that's the train in the middle on the table. It's the Silver Solarium, which is the dome car at the end, the Silver Garden, the Silver Palace, and the Cimarron River, the car that's red. That was a Frisco car that a gentleman in St. Louis owned. So we had the equipment ready to go. Some of the other bidders, I think, had pretty deep pockets, but they didn't have any equipment and didn't have an operating plan. So we had an operating plan and we had the equipment ready to go. It was still a real push to get to go by that early date. But and we had no locomotive, but we started with one of the M&A locomotives, so they leased us a locomotive. And all of the equipment was leased when we started. We, for instance, Tom told you about Rail Dome, which was a group of individuals, including myself and Tom and some of our other partners, but it had other partners involved. So we leased that car from Rail Dome. And another gentleman, one of our original owners, owned the Silver Palace, but again with other people. And the Silver Solarium was totally outside of our group completely, and the Cimarron River, same thing. So, of course, so let's mention the original owners. It was Tom, myself, and Isla. We called myself and Isla one of the partners because we had an equal share with the others, but there was both of us that were named. And then Saul Cass, who was Tom's boss at House of Lloyd in Kansas City. Dennis Studdard, one of our acquaintances from the Kansas City Railroad Museum. that we were both involved in, and Tom and I are both past presidents of that railroad museum, and another gentleman by the name of Gary Matthews, who owned the Silver Palace, and who also was from Kansas City. So all of the original partners were from Kansas City, and that's how this all got started. We already mentioned that Ilo has been the GM for a long time, the general manager since 1996. She was down here actually from 1993, sort of watching after our interests. And but then after 3 outside general managers over the first 3 or 3.5 years, that was not working very well. And our most senior partner, Saul, said, "Ilo, why don't you take over this job on an interim basis?" And we have friends in the railroad industry who still call Ilo and say, "Are you still doing that job on an interim basis?" But so she's, as I say, she's got some health issues, but she's doing well, and she's still managing the operation by phone from Kansas City day in and day out. So, okay, so we covered the present owners, which is Tom, Ilo, and myself, and now I guess we're back to Tom to give you a little bit more about the history of some of the early equipment. I think I trotted on you too.
That's okay. We're friends.
We're friends, yeah. By the way, Tom is our senior partner. He's 2 days older than I am.
And we were both born in St. Louis. Anyway, so we've been telling you a little bit about the original cars that we have. Those models in the middle, those are the 4 cars we started out with on August 1st, 1993. The red one on the end, the Cimarron River, was a sleeping car, which really didn't fit the operation as we wanted to do it, but it filled in for 3 months, I believe, and then it had to go away to fulfill other charter commitments that it had across the country. So the car that replaced it was the Westport, which we don't have a model of. But the Westport is the first car you see if you're coming down to ride the train. As you walk aboard the train, that's usually the first car behind the locomotive. It's the Westport.
You might say some of a little bit of, not getting too off color, but there were some interesting observations in that bedroom car during those first 3 months with some of our passengers.
They wanted to go in and close the doors. And, you know, the conductor would have to open the door to see, make sure that somebody's in there. And they'd say, "Oh, excuse me."
Vance Randolph lived here, guys. I don't know if you know that bit of Ozark history, but
No, I don't think.
Collector of the most brawdy tales that I had ever read.
Oh, no. Never met him.
No, before your time.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, the first train over there is, like Al said, is a model of the Missouri Pacific train that would have served Branson and Hollister in the 1950s. The second train is the one we started with in 1993. And the third train on the far right is some of the cars and the locomotives as we operate today. One of the big challenges we had when we first started out was, come right on in. As we started out, I lived in Kansas City, and Alan and I lived in Kansas City, so we had to hire some people down here to manage, and then I would come down every weekend. But things sort of got out of hand, and as often happens with a lot of businesses, Branson, they don't seem to be very well run in the beginning. About October, we were experiencing what I thought was fantastic ridership, but we hadn't seen any financial statements yet. The general manager hadn't been able to put anything together yet. And so I said, okay, well, at the end of the year, we finally figured out that there were no financial statements, and over the course of the first few months, there were a lot of bills in our name, which we didn't have all the money to pay. Make a long story short, when I figured all that out, I drove down here and I met with each and every one of the creditors in person, talked to them, explained the situation, said, if you'll bear with us, we'll be able to pay you back starting in spring when we start up again. We'll be able to do monthly payments and have you paid off by the end of the year. And we're thankful we were able to do that. So everybody we dealt with was very grateful, and we've never had that problem again since then. You were going to do the rest of those challenges, weren't you?
Yeah, I can, and
Yeah.
maybe I'll do a little bit about, well, to mention a little more about that first challenge. We've got challenges on our outline here, and I'll do all the rest of the challenges, but I'll start with that initial challenge. That initial challenge was created by one of our owners and our first general manager. And I think they were trying to bury the rest of us. And fortunately, Saul, our most senior partner at the time, had enough money to loan the company so we could stay in operation. Ultimately, that other owner we bought out in about another year or so, because he was absolutely trying to bury us. He kept asking us early on when we first got together while we were doing our proposal in Kansas City, but there's 4 of you guys who've known each other for a long time, and there's me. How are you going to protect me? What I didn't understand at the time was, how were we going to protect ourselves from him? And that was the issue. Now, when we first started our operation, we just had one locomotive, so we would have to run all the way to Bergman, Arkansas, about 30 miles, run the locomotive around the train on a passing track, and then bring the train back to Branson. And then we'd have to run up to Gretna to get the train back in order to go south again. That's a long time. And we quickly realized our passengers were getting bored silly by this long trip. And so over the course of time, we've evolved into having a locomotive on each end of the train, and we go out about 20 miles and come back, so that the length of the trip is 1 hour and 45 minutes, which is what the passengers would like to spend doing this. It's not that they've gone 20 miles out and 20 miles back, or 18 miles out and 18 miles back. It's 1 hour and 45 minutes. And when the railroad is doing track work, we might have some slow orders in some places. That's a railroad term for the engineer will get a directive that he can't go over like maybe 10 miles an hour for the next 2 miles. Well, if you're only going 10 miles an hour for 2 miles and you're normally running 25 miles an hour, that's going to slow you down. So we just go as long as the time comes up, and then we come back. Typically, we go south, which takes us through 2 long tunnels. One tunnel in a curve that's like 3/4 of a mile long, and then across a couple line trestles. When we run north, which we do at the direction of the railroad, we go to Crane, right? Galena at the James River. And we go through a tunnel at Reed Springs and across a couple of bridges in the meantime. It's a nice run as well, and in some cases it's equally as pretty as the South Run. South Run, of course, we go into Arkansas. So we started, but now with a locomotive on each end, we've totally wired the train so we can control the locomotive on the north end of the train from the locomotive on the south end of the train, or vice versa, or run them both together. So that saves us a lot of fuel when we're not, but we can always run with a locomotive in the lead, which allows us to run faster than if we don't have a locomotive in the lead. Yeah, I think did we mention all of the original owners? I think we did.
Yeah.
And
You
so-
never said your problem guy's name.
well,
Best not.
I bet not, but some of you fellows who were in town back then may know who he was. Could probably figure that out. We probably wouldn't have a problem. Everyone's deceased except for Tom Island and I, so we wouldn't have any issues there. But at any rate, yes, we won't mention his name. So, could we be successful just being an excursion train? Probably not. So, after time, we started doing Thomas the Tank Engine here in town. which is a little kiddies, is for kids. And there's Thomas the Tank Engine video on TV, and there's a lot of Thomas the Tank Engine train things you can buy. And so the Thomas the Tank Engine entity produced a little Thomas the Tank Engine that ran on the rails. It wasn't powered, but they would haul it around the country on a flatbed, and I think they had 4 or 5 of them. I think they had one actually that was a steam engine. And we would put it down where the 98 is, where our streamliner is, and then we put all our other locomotives on the other end, and we did Thomas the Tank Engine trips for usually 2 weeks, 2 weekends and a week in between in the summer. And that was very successful. We evolved from that into doing Polar Express, which is, we simulate the Tom Hanks movie, The Polar Express, and we do that in November and December. So it runs for a longer period than Thomas the Tank Engine, and it allows us to have more passengers. And on Saturday night, during the daylight saving period, we run a dinner train at 5 o'clock. So we're not just an excursion train, we're just not a dinner train, we're just not a special event train like Polar Express or Thomas the Tank Engine, we're all of the above. And I think if we took any one of those away, we would have a tough time being in business. So then a little bit about the challenges. We mentioned about getting into big debt right off, so that was our first challenge. Our next challenge was created by the same owner. He and that first general manager got in cahoots with the general manager of the railroad, who had since left that position and moved to Texas, and they started an operation in Cotter, in violation of our contract that says we had exclusive rights to operate anywhere on this line. So that was our next challenge. How do we solve all of that? So we did, and they ultimately went out of business because they could not get to Branson. Unfortunately, the convention center was our next challenge. When the convention center was announced out at the Grand Palace, it was stated that the railroad would be leaving town completely. Not just us, but the freight line. And then there were some people that said, well, what they're going to do is they're going to put a tunnel under Branson. That's never going to happen. I mean, that's billions of dollars to do something like that. So when they figured out they couldn't get rid of the railroad, they did everything, but we ended up losing property we leased to the city and the developer when they took $2 million to Omaha, Nebraska and bite off the Union Pacific. And so we lost, there was parking that the city had built on the east side of the railroad track. That was on railroad property. There was parking and facilities on the west side of the railroad track that we use for parking and facilities. And so we lost all of that. But we keep plugging along. And then the next challenge was the developer and the city wanted to add grade crossings between the convention center and the landing and cut our track in more places than it's already cut. And they would have cut it so many times that we wouldn't have had a place to park the train, because the train was longer than the distance between those places. So we went to a meeting at the city hall when all this was coming to bear, and the engineer that the developer had hired to do the infrastructure of roads and the railroad, et cetera, was there to present, as was MoDOT and the city engineer. We were prepared to say that we couldn't exist with this. Fortunately, we didn't have to. The gentleman who represented MoDOT stood up and said, "This is the dumbest idea I've ever heard. There's no way in the world we're going to add grade crossings when we're trying to take grade crossings away, because that saves lives." So fortunately, we didn't have to say a thing. I guess the next challenge was contract renewal after 15 years, and we actually hired an outside consultant to help us with that, and we ended up going to Omaha to the Union Pacific, who has to approve the contract with the M&A. And the interesting part of that conversation was the people we were dealing with said, let's write this contract and show your limits better defined than they were before, so we can't screw you again like we lost the property that we leased. And but that all turned out okay. So, but it was a challenge. Flooding has been a challenge on a couple of occasions. As Tom mentioned, we set the contract so we could run north or south. Typically, even if the railroad isn't running, because they're washed out, they're not washed out both ways. So we run even if the railroad isn't running. There was one time when they were washed out both ways. In a few days, we could not operate. And sometimes the tunnels get flooded when there's a lot of rain, so that slows us down occasionally. And then you all remember the tornado of 2012. So that happened like 2 days before we were due to open. And I saw a picture out here of the hotel where half of the windows were sucked out of the hotel and all that glass came down on us. So we lost a windshield, but through a mutual friend who had a locomotive similar to ours that wasn't being used, we were able to borrow a windshield for the 98, since you can't go down to Lowe's and buy one of those. And so we got by that with, were we down at all, or a few days, I think, but not too many.
We pretty much opened up on schedule to everybody's amazement, but at the end of the year, we had to send both locomotives up to be repainted.
Right. Well, we had some good other little wrinkle on the insurance. Our insurance starts every 1st of March, so it ends in February. Well, that was leap year. So the old insurer, we switched insurance companies that year, got to take care of us on the 29th, and that's the day of the tornado.
Needless to say, the newer insurer was really happy.
Yeah. But the old insurer did a really nice job. He was really puzzled, but a lot of our dome glass got pitted such that it had to be replaced. And he called at the depot and spoke with Isla, and he was from the adjuster was out of St. Louis, but the insurance company was out of Boston. So he was in Boston. So Isla was saying, well, this is glass on the top of the cars and all. And then he saw, when playing in Boston, a commercial that the Chamber of Commerce put out. And he called Isla back. He said, I saw your train and I see what I'm doing. I'm in, I'll cover that. So I guess our last challenge is COVID-19. So how many, I don't think we can count the number of webinars and we've participated in, from insurance companies to agencies that do financial planning and financial, do payroll for you and things like that. So we've been to, and then our relationship with our peer railroads. They've been having, and for a while, weekly webinars with people they would bring on to be the guest panel for that day. We're running almost every car we own in the train now, but by doing that, and social distancing with 50% capacity, we can get up to 50% capacity, which is good. So we're generating our cash flow, so that's doing well. But we're running equipment we wouldn't normally operate at this time of the year. We would operate it for Polar Express. So we've had some challenges, but we've overcome them all, and we're proud to be here, and we're very proud, as Tom said, to have paid all the creditors who we owed money to early on. And that might be some of you folks here in town that are here today. I'm not for sure, but it could well be.
One of the other topics we thought we should cover with you is an organization called the Railroad Passenger Car Alliance. It was formed in 1982, And it was formed by a bunch of people similar to Rail Dome that had cars, but they wanted to charter around the country. But there was no central clearing place for where to go to find a car and put together a train, and then have that same train go from different locations, like one weekend in Cincinnati, another weekend in Indianapolis, and then on around for the fall season. And that's why the Railroad Passenger Car Alliance was formed. And like I said, in 1982, and over the years, we've been members ever since we started in 1993. Rail Dome was a member since '82 when it started. And I have to tell you that I don't think we'd be where we are today without the support of the Railroad Passenger Car Alliance. We'll call it RPCA for short. It's really a group of people who think like you, who have the same budget you do, and they learn how to make do with what they've got and then come off with a really great product. And we were so thrilled about the organization. We've hosted 2 conventions in Branson for them over the years, and one year we hosted another convention up in Kansas City, and we took the entire train to Kansas City Union Station, parked it at Union Station for the whole weekend that we were up there, and on Saturday or Sunday we took the entire train and all the convention attendees to Topeka, Kansas, where their passenger car shops are. And so we got a big tour of all their passenger car shops. And then we took the train back to Kansas City. Everybody got off and said, wow, that'll never happen again. And they're right, it never has happened again. So we owe a great debt of gratitude to RPCA. The magazine cover that you've got with you, that happened 2 years ago in conjunction with our 25th anniversary. And that's the only time we've been on the cover of Trains magazine. We've been in other magazines, but never the cover over the years. So we're very happy with that. And the gentleman who came down to photograph it back in March of that year, we took the whole train out just for him, so he could decide where he wanted to stop the train and take pictures. And that's one of the pictures that the editors, not the editor, but I guess the board at the magazine, they liked it the best. So that's, you see, you got what you see.
That magazine has about 100,000 circulation.
I think you're up again.
Am I up again?
Yep.
Well, I wanted to touch on the fabulous relationships we have with the Branson community. If it wasn't for the sign man making signs for us, and Branson Upholstery fixing the upholstery in the train, and Lloyd's Electric finding parts that we can't find anyplace, and L&J Plumbing, who both were our neighbors right here when we first came to town, and the bank, we just have some fabulous relationships. The city, the police department, the fire department, also the Hollister. Our North Pole for Polar Express is the Hollister Depot. So we have a great relationship with the Hollister people to do that. And then we have a great relationship with the Meyer Hotel Group, who does the drive-through Christmas lights up at Gretna. And we're a sponsor of that. So we're very, very pleased and couldn't be happier with our local relationships. Last year, when the Muleborn burned, our train was south of here for a dinner train run. When we got back to town, well, somebody had already started to alert us, Island Eye, that was going on. So we could not get back to Branson. So through the fire chief, Ted Martin, and his emergency preparedness group, he arranged for all sorts of different church buses to go all the way back out south to Cricket, which is the next grade crossing. It's all the way up the hill, like 10 miles, and come and pick up all of our passengers and bring it back to Branson. We didn't get the train back to the depot until the middle of the night, like 2 or 3 in the morning. So that's the type of relationships that we really, really appreciate. We talked a little bit about train maintenance already, but we do most of the maintenance we self-perform. We have some local and regional contractor support, and then we have suppliers that are the same suppliers for the big Class 1 railroads, but they put up with us buying one traction motor every 2 years, not 500 traction motors, and so which is what drives the locomotive. It's a big electric motor that hangs down on the axle. But our maintenance crew changes those traction motors and wheel sets right here in Branson, out in our shop. Oh, that's the sky. So they do a fabulous job. Some of you probably know Austin Roberts, and he's our chief mechanic. And when Tom mentioned the train was, or the locomotives were in KC to be painted the second time, we were also doing a radiator. Austin was doing a radiator job where he took out a radiator, took it to Springfield, had the radiator shop in Springfield rebuild it, because you can't buy one that fits that old locomotive. And then he went up to Kansas City to install it. And the head of the shop up there says, well, you can't do that. You'll have to take the roof off the locomotive. And Austin said, we'll show you how to do that. So they have their own tricks. Was working smart. Tom, back to equipment.
Well, we talked about the equipment already quite a bit, and they mentioned the model trains back there, but the reason we did the printout with all the equipment is because there's a lot of information there, and I couldn't remember it all when I'm talking, so I had to write it all out. But basically, and you can take that with you, and you'll know more about the train than you probably want to know, but you can pass it on if you don't want it. Basically, over the years, after we started out, we kept acquiring equipment, we kept leasing equipment, but we also acquired equipment when we could. And one of the hallmarks of our operation is that we seem to have a knack for finding cars that don't have a home and getting a good deal on them. And we bring them to Branson, and we fix them up, and we fix them up to our specifications, and then we're able to run them. And so that's pretty much how it's gone over the years. We like to buy cheap, fix it up, and make it look real good to where it runs the way we want it to run. And that's been a successful formula for us. One of the unique cars, two of the unique cars we have are the Silver Garden and the Silver Terrace. Back in February 1953, those two cars were on the inaugural train called the Kansas City Zephyr that ran from Kansas City to Chicago. It left Kansas City at noon and got to Chicago at 8 o'clock that night. And then they would reverse and come back, and the night train was called the American Royal Zephyr. The Silver Garden has inside, underneath the dome, a galley. And it has an upper lounge and a lower lounge. And that little galley down there had two people in it. They would cook sandwiches and do drinks and that stuff. And they would serve people on that car and one of the other cars. The train also had a full dining car, similar to the Silver Chef that we have. So we tended to stick toward the two Kansas City Zephyr cars and all the Zephyr cars that we could find. So that's why we have four of them now: the Silver Garden, Silver Chef for Kansas City Zephyr. The Silver Island, the other dome car, was built in 1947 for the Twin Cities Zephyrs, which ran between Chicago and the Twin Cities. And then the Silver Chef was built in 1956 for the Denver Zephyr. And funny thing is, when all these trains started disappearing, then the cars would run all over the country. Like the Silver Garden has been in not only the Kansas City Zephyr, when that was discontinued in 1959, I believe. We started running on the California Zephyr, the Denver Zephyr. Everywhere the car needed to go, they would send it. So it's been all over the country.
Everything stays.
Yes, and because of our experience with Rail Dome, and we like stainless steel cars, we kept that same plan all the way through Branson Scenic. So every car we've got is a stainless steel car, which means it'll be here long after we're gone. But the other reason too is because you don't have to paint them. And as you know, paint wears out. The sun fades it, it gets dinged by different things, and about every 4 or 5 years you got to repaint a car, and those aren't cheap. So over the years we've avoided that because we have all stainless steel, and we just keep it looking bright by using an acid wash that brightens up the stainless and makes the train look brand new again. And our own maintenance staff does that. We do that ourselves. And talking about the maintenance staff again, I got to say, to try to wrap this up, that we're very fortunate over the years. We've always had great employees. Whether it be in the gift shop, in the reservation area, on the train, the mechanical groups. There seems to be a pool of just great people in the Branson area to draw from and help make our operation a success. And we really appreciate that. Are there any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Speaking to both of you, did your interest begin in your childhood?
Yes.
When I was 6 months old, my mom dropped me when she was getting off a railroad car. And I hit the ground, and I got $500 from the Wabash Railroad because the conductor didn't take her hand and help her down the steps.
Oh.
So yeah, I was imprinted at an early age.
Yeah, I too. I always liked trains and had model trains, but I think the real bite came when the Frisco Railroad ran a train called the Meteor between St. Louis and Oklahoma City. It was an overnight train. I have a bunch of relatives in Oklahoma City, although I grew up in St. Louis, but my folks lived there. So Aunt Doll was going back to Oklahoma City, so my folks drove her down to the station, a Union Station, and my dad says, well, let's walk out the platform. You could do that back then. You could walk out on the platform any place. You know, you could walk out down to the airport, right, to the plane. It's not like it is today. And let's go down and look at the locomotive. So we did, and the engineer said, Sonny, you want to come up in the cab? Sure. So I think that's where I really got the love. But yeah, it goes back to being when I was a kid.
You mentioned when you got your first equipment or your first cars that you were the only bidders that had a place to store those. Where would somebody store something like that? I mean,
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because Al and I first met when we were both members of a railroad museum group in Kansas City back then it was called the Smoky Hill Railroad. And so that's how we met. But we were involved in the museum, which had its own tracks. At that time, I believe, was at Richards Gebaur Air Force Base.
Yeah.
So we had a place to move the cars out to Richards Gebaur in Grandview. So it was just a short period of they were stored in Byron's Ford Industrial Park, which is 63rd in Manchester, in an industrial park.
mm-hmm.
So we had the railroad hook them all up, haul them out to Richards Gebaur and drop them off.
Very good.
Do these companies continue to make cars?
No, the Bud Company manufactured all these cars in Pennsylvania. It was in Philadelphia. They had a huge plant there in Philadelphia. And I believe the last cars they made were in 1959.
About that.
They continued making some commuter rail equipment after that, but not for very long. So typically, when these cars, like the Silver Garden and Silver Terrace, when they were built brand new, were like $250,000 brand new, which was a lot of money back in 1952. If you had to go and have one built today, which is impossible, but if you went back to the plant where they made them, they'd probably be over $1 million a copy now.
Now, there are a couple of companies. Bombardier makes passenger equipment for Amtrak and for the commuter lines, but there's, of course, demand for that type of equipment is much, much less than it used to be. Although we're seeing a resurgence in intercity travel, high-speed travel, so there's basic. I think some European countries have supplied the domestic market, and some Japanese countries. I don't think any Chinese companies have they, Tom? Supplied the U.S. market.
Yes, they've started doing that.
They've started doing that too. So, at any rate, there is an uptick in the use of passenger equipment. But when Amtrak took over in '71 from the railroads, you know, there was just hundreds of cars that didn't have a place to go because Amtrak wasn't running that complete system. And what kept the railroads running passenger trains so long was the postal service and the mail that they moved by train. So when the postal service went to moving all mail by plane, all of those contracts were gone, and the railroad then couldn't afford to run a passenger train because they didn't have those mail contracts.
And when that happened, a lot of railroads discontinued their passenger trains.
You got a question?
I did. I wondered, does each train have its own log so that you know its history, or how do you know all its history and where it's been?
We're history buffs, and in addition to being rail fans, they're very intertwined.
Yeah, there's no log for the car or anything. I don't know if we mentioned it. The oldest car is the Westport that there isn't a model for. It was built in 1939. And the newest car is what, the Chef?
Chef, 1956.
56. Locomotive, the streamlined locomotive, the 98 that's on this end of the table was built in, what's that, 51?
51.
And the GT30, the freight locomotive that's on the other end of the train,
62.
62. So,
And
and
what-
this Railroad Passenger Car Alliance, there's a lot of, I call it an educational clearinghouse. Their website has all sorts of specs from when these cars were built and how they were maintained. And then there's people involved with that. That's a group of not only equipment users, you would say, like Branson Scenic, but equipment suppliers or maintainers. In fact, Amtrak, Union Pacific, and the BNSF are also members of that group because Union Pacific and BNSF have their own passenger car fleet that they use for special trains. And but those are all cars from back in that era. And in fact, if you want to become a certified brake technician for a passenger car, which you have to be, it used to be the Railroad Passenger Car Alliance who did that, but there's an offshoot from that does that now. So if the UP wants to get their brake guy certified, he has to go to school that there's 2 or 3 a year put on by an air brake company out of Pittsburgh. So yes, as Tom said, valuable organization as far as we're concerned.
What
Well,
other
I might like to put this in context for you, Owen. The last passenger service regularly through Branson was 1961. So that was how many years till you came before?
61 to 93.
22, I guess.
Also, the
Nope,
depot,
32.
32.
and the track laid down first here in 1905, and the trains ran beginning in 1906. The depot they occupied came along very shortly afterwards. So they're carrying a tradition of great length here, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
I do have one more. If I hear the railroad in the middle of the night, that's Union Pacific running freight somewhere?
That's Missouri and northern Arkansas running freight here. You mean if you're here in town?
Well, it sounds like it's off to the west.
Well, that would have to be here locally if you're here.
Running freight?
Freight, yes.
Running freight.
The Union Pacific runs, there's a power plant on the south end that's coal-fired. The coal comes from Powder River Basin in Wyoming, and the coal comes through Kansas City and then over to St. Louis and then down through Poplar Bluff to the power plant on the south end of this line that sort of gets towards Little Rock, but not all the way. The empties come back up over the hill. And so if you see Union Pacific locomotives pulling a bunch of hopper cars, you'll always see them going north because they're going back empty. And they go back to Wyoming to get loaded again to make that trip again. So that's a unit. But then there's other freight on the line that
It's a chicken train.
there's the chicken train, the Tyson feed plant in Bergman gets a unit train a week of grain, corn, and other grains to make the chicken feed. So those chickens eat a lot of chicken feed. And 60, 80 cars a week of going there. And then there's other freight. The charcoal plant gets some cars. I'm not sure exactly what they get, but they get some tank cars. Or maybe there's a residue they're discharging into those tank cars. I'm not sure. So what they call the local train, which is the train that stops and does all the switching along the route, it starts on the south end that runs from Carthage to the south end. It starts out at Cotter and runs north, and then the other train starts, the southbound train starts in Carthage and runs south, doing the switching along the road, and then they meet in Gretna and switch crews. So the crew of the northbound train takes the train on north, and the crew from the southbound train takes the northbound train back north to Carthage, and the crew on the northbound train takes the southbound train on south and does switching along the route. So that just allows those crews to get home every day.
So how many of you have ridden the train? Well, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
One last question?
Yes, ma'am.
Certainly.
You guys, your group owns the train. Do you rent the depot?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's part of our lease with the Missouri and Northern Arkansas.
Right.
Oh, okay.
The operating rights to the track, the depot and the station grounds and our parking lot, that's all owned by the Missouri and Northern Arkansas / Union Pacific. So yeah, that's all part of our deal, plus the operating crew, the 2 engineers that run our train all the time, and then the dispatching services, which is an interesting story. The dispatcher for this railroad is in Vermont.
What does he do?
It's called a dark railroad because there aren't any signals. So he gives a track warrant, and he reads that track warrant to the engineer, giving him permission to go from milepost such and such to milepost such and such. And then that engineer has to read that all back. And then they exchange signatures over the radio. And now I'm sure he has some sort of computer backup system there that says, okay, I gotta block that out because this is a train that's occupying that, now nobody else can occupy that. So that's how this system is dispatched. And of course, we don't want to be out there if there's a 135 car northbound coal train coming north and we're going south. We don't want to be there. So they do a fabulous job. Very, very often, they'll schedule that northbound coal train that it comes through Branson between our train. We have a 11:30 train and it gets back at 1:15.
Yep.
And it leaves again at 2. So that train will come through here between 1:15 and 2 o'clock.
And we've had some Polar Express trains at night where they brought through one of their night freights in between our trains.
Yeah.
So if you broke down, your train broke down,
Then
they reached the dispatcher then?
right. Well, the engineer who has that track warrant has to give up that track warrant again by radio. So if he hasn't given up the track warrant, then nobody else can occupy that track. So if we break down and for instance can't even get a hold of the dispatcher for some reason, it's pretty good. Back in earlier days, there were some dead spots in their radio communications, but if that engineer doesn't give up that warrant, then the dispatcher can't assign anybody else to that track.
Okay.
And I don't think we've ever broken down that we couldn't get back.
No, I don't think
That's why we have 2 locomotives, one on each end.
Right, right. We have a lot of redundancy built into our, we have, all the cars are heated, cooled, lit by electricity from a big generator, and we have 2 big generators, and so we only need 1.
So if the generator in our power car goes down, we have a generator in the 98 locomotive that we can instantly fire up, and that provides power to the whole train again. So we never, you might lose the air conditioning for a little bit, but not very long. And that's happened.
Yeah, certainly has.
Well, remembering the days when I rode trains in my childhood with the windows open and cinders in my eyes, I appreciate that air conditioning. Gentlemen, we thank you so very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for the
Used
opportunity.
a lot of time, and if you're willing, maybe people still like to visit with you.
Sure.
Sure.
We'd be
The
glad to.
program is over with. Thank you.
Thank you.